press record, and now we'll be going. So again, I appreciate you all for joining us this morning. My name is Mark Kirk. I am the Nutrition Research Director at Master's Choice. We are a seed corn company, and so just wanted to present what we know as of now, what we are in the process of discovering about Flowery grain. For some of you who may not know who we are, just want to give you a quick, introduction to Master's Choice. We are an independently owned and operated corn company. The picture there is the Crabtree family who have ownership of Master's Choice. We have our proprietary genetics that were established in 1978, and we are a livestock-focused corn company. About 40% of the corn grown in the United States is fed to livestock, poultry, beef, swine, and dairy. And so we feel like that's probably a very underserviced segment of the market. And so we wanted to breed and develop and select hybrids that are specifically grown, specifically targeted for high yields and nutritional value for livestock operations. And so right now, most of our research has been concentrated on the dairy aspect. We're branching out into other things, looking at some poultry things, and then going ahead and going into the beef. But a lot of what you will see today will be research that we have dug into and uncovered, or research that we have done, especially in the dairy arena. So I just want to kind of let you know who we work with. Dr. Charlie Sniffen is part of our nutrition team. He and some other nutritionists. We've done some work at Cornell University, Penn State, South Dakota State. Of course, we do a lot of work at Cumberland Valley and Rock River Labs there in Wisconsin, and doing some work at Minor Institute. So those are the people that we've been working with over the last few years. I've been on staff here at Master's Choice for probably, actually this is going on my 4th year. And so these are the people that I myself have direct contact with and are working with. So I want to start out here and just kind of give you an outline of the things that will be covered today. We'll be talking basically what is flowery grain and the advantages of flowery grain. We'll be talking about the physical characteristics, the chemical characteristics, the digestibility advantages, the passage rate advantages, and the advantages then of rumen degradable starch. And then also a study that we did at South Dakota State where we found some advantages in nutrient absorption. And so I hope that all of these are things that you came prepared to look at and are interested in. And so as we go through this, like I said, if you've got any questions, you can type them down and I will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. So first of all, as we look at the characteristics of flowery grain, what exactly is flowery grain? Well, when we talk about flowery corn, we're talking about the grain portion there, and we're talking about as we look at these corn kernels here. These are some Master's Choice flowery grain, and we're talking about the white, starchy part of the endosperm. All corn grain has about the same amount of starch in it. But what we're talking about is the ratio of soft, floury starch as opposed to hard, heavy, slick, vitreous starch that you see over here. Now, most corn grain has some form, at least dent corn, has some form of flowery grain in it, but what we're talking about is the ratio and the availability of that. What we know is that as we go back in time, back in the 60s, we began to export a lot of grain, and we began to excessively handle grain. And when we had flowery type hybrids that were grown and fed on the farm, that was perfect. But when we began to export a lot of grain and excessively handle it, then we began to have problems with breakage and fines. And so the corn industry began to develop corn hybrids that were more vitreous in nature. and had this hard, heavy, slick, sharp, glassy endosperm to protect the floury starch on the inside. Well, I mean, that was good for exporting corn, hold up to all of those rigors, but also we discovered that that kind of corn also didn't break down in the digestive system of animals. And here we are feeding 40% of the corn grown in the United States to animals, but we're still feeding them corn that has been developed for livestock. And the physical characteristics of this are that this white starch is soft, it's floury, and that it is readily available starch. And it handles a whole lot different, not only in the animal but also when we grind it. These two samples down here, I ground here at the office for the same amount of time in a grinder. And what you can see here is that these two varieties, that the floury grain broke down into what we would consider floury particles. Now, if we had a big tub of this grain ground up, what we would find is if you put your hand in it, it would actually stick to your hand more than you would find with this hard, heavy, slick, vitreous type corn. And in fact, you'll see here that even though these samples were ground at the same amount of time, you can still see large particles there that were that never did break down, even in the grinding process. And so what we find is that when we feed these to animals, not only do they not get the energy out of them, but they end up passing through and into the manure. This picture over here on the right-hand side was is from University of Wisconsin, and I should have quoted here, and I can't remember if it's Dr. Shaver or not, but I think that's who that is. And basically, what we see is 5 corn kernels in this picture: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This being 100% opaque mutant type corn, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And this is a Master's Choice Flowery grain. And basically, the level of vitreousness a lot of times is determined by how much of the light shines through. The physical characteristics of vitreous corn is that it has the same properties as glass. It allows light to shine through. It is hard, it is slick, but it is also sharp when we grind it up, as opposed to floury grain or even opaque grain that is more dense. I say dense, not necessarily dense, but the structure is so different that it does not allow light to pass through it. And so these are the physical characteristics of the grain that we are looking for breeding and selecting. Are the physical characteristics are like the floury grain there you see in that picture. So what is it that's going on inside of these corn kernels that is causing these physical characteristics? Well, we know that there are about 7 different genes that actually produce floury type corn. And all of those genes have something to do with the zane prolamine content in the corn kernel. If we were to look at an electron microscope picture, and I think these pictures again came out of the University of Wisconsin, if we were to look at these again, what we would see is that the big heavy particle, or the big particles here, the rounder particles, are the actual starch molecules. Now we know that starch is basically a bunch of glucose simple sugars all packed together into what we call starch. And so that's the starch molecule, and then in between all of those is the prolamine protein that is an indigestible protein, that it is not rumen degradable, and it may not even be a monogastrically available protein. And so basically, the more of that starch that or the more of the prolamine that you have, the tighter bound that starch is, and it becomes that vitreous type corn kernel. These two pictures down here, and I want to talk through these for a second. What you can see is kind of this honeycomb structure that encapsulates the starch. This is a freshly harvested corn silage starch right here, as opposed to a corn silage starch. I apologize. A corn silage starch that is that has been in fermentation for a while. And what we know throughout kind of historical and anecdotal and even some research is that the longer corn silage is in style, the more available the starch becomes, and that is because that prolamine protein breaks down in acids and alcohols, which is made in the fermentation process. So the chemical things going on inside of here are this binding material. There's four types of prolamine protein: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And whether or not a corn is floury or whether it is vitreous is going to depend on which one of these prolamine proteins is there and the amount of them. And it appears that that alpha zane prolamine protein is the culprit, so to speak, as we think about the vitreous type corn. And so that's the chemical things going on inside of there. So what difference does this make? What difference does it make if a corn is hard, heavy, is slick, and vitreous, or whether it is floury? Well, I did some testing, and basically what I did is I took several samples of Master's Choice corn, and I used a kind of a group of proprietary tests to test hardness. Okay, and so what we have is basically a texture ranking from the softest to the hardest. Half of these samples were also sent to Rock River Labs, where we did 7-hour in situ tests, and we repeated those. We repeated those in situ several times. And so this was the average of those digestibilities. And basically what we found is this nice correlation, which was the softer the corn was, the more digestible it was. The harder the corn was down here, the less digestible it was. Okay? And so how much more? What were the differences? Well, we're going to look at these two samples here, and I'll admit to you this is the most digestible and least digestible, but you'll see how they fall on the texture ranking, whether they were soft or hard. And basically what we had is 49% in situ digestibility versus 33% digestibility. Well, those are 17 percentage points in difference, but actually that is 50% more starch digested. And think about this: 17% or 16.5% more digested. Okay, the difference here, these 16 percentage point, is actually half of this. And so there was actually 50% more starch digested in the softer texture corn. So, and this was basically the difference were just texture. We tested texture and digestibility. And so and so when we make that correlation there, we find that there can be up to 50% more, according to that test, up to 50% more starch digestion over the Flowery versus the vitreous. Now, we have to be careful when we think about this, and many of you, especially you guys who feed cows, you will know that if I put 50% more starch in a diet, I can run into problems. And so really what we're talking here is not just greater production, but we're also talking feed efficiency here. And so with floury corn, we're seeing more of that starch being utilized, and especially within dairy cows and ruminant animals, we're seeing more of that starch degraded in the rumen. Okay, and up to about 50% more of that starch degraded in the rumen. Now, these were dry grain samples, and I want to make sure that I made that point. So we'll kind of be bouncing back and forth between dry grain and silage type numbers here throughout this presentation, but these were dry ground corns that we were testing. Okay, and so as we look at these, we also not only need to talk about the rate of digestion and the amount of digestion, so how much was digested in a certain amount of time, but we also need to talk about passage rates. Okay, and these numbers came from a study from Mike Allen, Oba, and Allen out of 2005, where they had duodenally cannulated cows, and they were feeding basically different starch types to these cows and checking the passage rates. Okay, and if you need my resources here or any quote, basically where I got this information, I'll be happy to give it to you. So if you want to request that, I'll be happy to give that. This was Allen and Oba, 2005. And so basically what they wanted to do was just see how the type of starch affected the passage rate through the cows. And so they had some dry Flowery corn and some dry Vitreous corn, and as they measured the passage rate out of the rumen, what they discovered in the measurements they got was that the Flowery corn passed at a rate of about 10% an hour, 10.9, 11% an hour, as opposed to the dry Vitreous corn that passed at over 21% an hour. Okay, so this is how fast it's moving through the rumen. So if we think back to the physical characteristics of the corn, that makes a lot of sense. That dry Vitreous corn, that horneous endosperm corn, would be heavy and slick. We know that the specific gravity of rumen fluid is somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2, and we know that vitreous corn as a whole has a specific gravity over 1.3, but those hard, heavy, slick particles have to measure greater than 1.3, and when we put those kinds of particles in the rumen that are over 1.3 specific gravity, they fall very quickly to the bottom of the rumen. Okay, so they fall past the protozoal layer, they fall past the basically the liquid layer, they fall past the rumen mat, and they fall to the bottom where they are passed out very quickly. And since they are heavier than the fluid, they're actually passing faster out of the rumen, faster than the fluid is. And so if we're not giving it, number one, time to digest in the rumen, and we're not making that starch free and available because it's bound in that prolamin protein material, we're actually putting the ruminant animal at a disadvantage when we're feeding vitreous type corns. Okay, and so vitreous corns are passing out. Well, if we can theorize that if the vitreous corn is passing at 21% an hour in 4.5 hours, all of the starch has effectively left the rumen and not even giving time. Whereas with the dry Flowery corn, it's still at 4.5 hours, 50% of the starch that has been presented to the rumen is still in there, theoretically. So Dr. Allen and his team, they didn't just test the dry Flowery corn, they tested high moisture corn, and they had high moisture Flowery versus high moisture Vitreous. Now, there's been some talk and discussion, and a lot of things that we'll see at times will tell us that when we ensile corn or when we take it at less than dry corn maturity, there's virtually no difference between how it interacts in the cow, the digestibility, but there is a big difference for sure in the passage rate. Okay, and so what we can see is that the high moisture Flowery was passing at 4% an hour, as opposed to the high moisture Vitreous that was again 10% an hour. All right, and so what is often interesting to me in this study is that you'll see that the dry Flowery and the high moisture Vitreous corn are passing at the same rate. Now, we're talking about texture here. Even the difference between dry Flowery corn and high moisture corn is mainly a texture difference. Okay, I mean, obviously it's maturity also, but it is a texture. That the texture of those starches are different, and those are making a difference as we're feeding that to animals. One of the things that I often say is that texture affects everything when we are feeding animals. The texture of the corn that we're feeding. I mean, you even think about it when we think whether we want to get into this argument or not at some point, but when we think about how we process corn silage, shredlage is all about texture. We're changing the texture of that corn fodder. And here with grain, we have the same instance. The texture of the grain is affecting everything as we're feeding animals. Okay, so there's a digestibility advantage. There's also a passage rate advantage when we're looking at Floury versus vitreous corn. So there's also, I want to talk a little bit about why rumen degradable starch is so important. Why do we want why do we want rumen? Why do we want the starch degraded in the rumen? And I'm looking at a question, and I'll answer your question when we get to the end, Steve. And maybe this is a good part. Steve's asked a question here. Didn't Alan find having starch digested in the rumen was deterrent for milk production due to the increase or decrease in fiber digestion? And so Steve, there is a good point to that, and you're right. When we overfeed that, what we can have is a decrease, especially when we throw her into an acidotic state. But when we look at fermentable starch in the rumen, what we know is that we have two things going on there. Number one, we have microbial yield. Okay, we have an advantage in microbial yield. We have microbial production. Okay, and so when we look at this, so I talked to Dr. Gaser. He and I were working on this project, Dr. Gaser, there at Rock River Labs, and I said, okay, so we have this digestibility difference. What kind of difference do we have in microbial yield? And he said between the hardest and the softest, we have a greater microbial yield of 133 grams. So then I went back to Dr. Sniffen, and I said, Dr. Sniffen, if we have this difference, if we have this microbial difference, how big a difference does microbial yield make? Well, and he says, well, Mark, he says, if we compare corn silages, now remember that the hardness test here was dry grain, and he correlates it back to corn silage. He said, if we look at corn silages and we have a 7-hour starch degradability from 70% to 78%, he says we can increase that result 41 grams. He said in his CPM model that 41 gram increase in microbial protein supply will effectively can create 5 pounds of milk increase in production. And so when we look at this, the reason rumen degradable starch is important, number one here, is because of we have this greater microbial production, but also what we know about rumen degradable starch is the fact that we also have volatile fatty acid production. The propionate is increased. Now we can't over increase propionate. That's where I think we have the decrease in milk production. I also would wonder that having starch digested in the rumen, as the question asks, when we look at this, if we overfeed that, we're definitely going to have that problem. If we have overproduction of propionate, we're going to have problems. But propionate is what helps us to drive, lactose for milk synthesis. Okay, so we've got to have that. We want to have that all digested there. There's also been here in the recent days that as we have looked at this and looking at the site of digestion and the advantages of the site of digestion, we know that greater ruminal starch digestion allows for greater total tract digestion because as this study here states, it's a highly digestible starch sources have higher digestibilities in all digestive compartments, and that there is limited compensatory starch digestion in the lower tract for starches with low ruminal digestion. Okay, so the greater ruminal digestion we have, the greater small intestine digestion we have, and in fact the less hindgut digestion that we have. In fact, as I was reading this week, as I got my my minor institute farm report, some of you may have read that Shane Fredden in there did a little write-up on what's the optimal site for starch digestion, and basically said that if we have an increase of starch, they had some duodenally cannulated cow and just basically put in the study he's quoting in there. They put in some starch directly into the small intestine as it passed out of the rumen, so it effectively went into the small intestine. Basically, they saw no increase in milk production when they introduced it right there, but that the conclusion of all of these things is that most starch should be, and this is a quote from Shane, and I'm reading it at the moment, most starch should be targeted for ruminal digestion. Shifting the site of starch digestion to the small intestine does not increase milk yield or supply of metabolizable amino acids. So we want starch digested in the rumen. We don't want an over digestion in a very quick passage out of the rumen. What we want is we want starch digested there for volatile fatty acid production. That's where we drive milk production, and for microbial protein, which is basically amino acids to the cow, and so that she can have for milk production and body condition and all of those things. So as we look at this, there's advantages in the digestibility, advantages in the passage rate, advantages in being able to degrade it in the rumen. But one of the most interesting studies that we have had, and I'm here. We got another question from Steve. Steve says, but Alan found that total tract digestion was not different, didn't he, between soft and hard texture? And you're right. Alan did see that, but my question is, where was that corn digested? So if that total tract starch digestion was in the small intestine, then it did not go to milk production. And if it was in the hindgut, then it didn't go to anything but maybe bloody bowel syndrome as we ferment corn in the hindgut. So we can have the same amount of starch digestion found throughout the total tract, okay? But where is it digested? And that site of digestion is going to make a big difference. And so even though we have total tract digestion, all right. So at the end we measure the manure, and there's only X percent. There's 4% in the manure with hard corn and 4% manure in the soft corn. Okay. So let's just say that that's the way we've measured that. Then my question is, that site of digestion had an influence on how much milk production that we had. So we can have the same amount of total tract digestion, but if we don't have that starch degraded in the rumen, then we are not making milk with it. So great question, Steve, and would love the question. So I appreciate that. So one of the biggest things that we found here, and I'll throw this out this way. This is a very interesting study. It was a calf starter trial that we did at South Dakota State with Dr. Casper. And basically we fed about 30 calves, Master's Choice corn silage, Master's Choice, sorry about that, calf starter, and then a control calf starter with just regular corn that he got from the elevator there. Okay, and so a calf starter with a Flowery grain and a calf starter with just an industry grain that we had, and so we had a numerical difference in ending weights. You can see that down here at the bottom, and this is a numerical difference in ending weights, but it is not a statistical difference. Okay, so we had about 5 pounds of numerical difference in ending weights. The most interesting part about all of this is that when we took fecal samples, or when Dr. Casper and his team took fecal samples at the end of 42 days, what we found is that those calves at the end of 42 days were digesting a significant amount of more dry matter. 94% of the dry matter going in at the end of 42 days was being digested. More crude protein. Here's what's very interesting is more of the fiber was being digested. Okay, so more of the fiber was being digested at the end of 42 days, and not a significant amount of the hemicellulose, the quick sugar there from that calf starter, or the starch. So not a significant amount being digested, but more of the dry matter was being digested. All right, and so when we think about this, more of this fiber was being digested in these calves at the end of 42 days. Not only that, but they were digesting more of the nutrients. Okay, more of the minerals, calcium, and all the way down except for copper down here. And not exactly sure what was going on there. Maybe they just had all that they needed. So as Dr. Casper and I were in Kansas City, as he presented this study at the annual meeting last year, he and I were sitting down talking, and I said, okay, so what's making the difference here? Why are we seeing such a difference in nutrient digestibility? And he said, probably primary. He says, well, there's two things. He said, secondary part of that is probably the soft corn is kind of gelatinizing in the rumen, or in the pseudo rumen actually at that point, and causing everything to slow down. So there's probably a little bit more nutrient digestion by that. But he said, Mark, the biggest thing here is when we see this fiber digestibility. He says basically what we're doing is, he says, is we're in essence developing rumen function faster. And he said it probably has to do with the degradability and volatile fatty acids that are being produced by the corn degrading and encouraging papilia growth, and in the rumen, encouraging that faster and allowing us to digest more, which is kind of interesting because on the human side, or the monogastric side, the industry is talking about resistant starch, and how resistant starch, being resistant to digestion and absorption in monogastrics in the small intestine, and passing through to what we would call the colon. If we have starch left over there, it actually helps colon health because of the volatile fatty acids that are being produced there when we ferment things in our colon. And so I think it's kind of interesting that there's a little bit of a correlation between those two things there. So very interesting here that the only difference here and this was pretty significant to me, because the only differences in these two calf starters were the type of corn that were being fed. So the type of corn that was being fed in this little bit of calf starter to these calves was making a pretty significant difference in the digestibility of the materials. So, all right, I think that, yeah. So we've produced a kind of a nutrition research summary that has this information in it, a little bit more information in it. If that's something that you would be interested in, you can go to our website, seedcorn.com, or you can contact me directly. My email is right there. Are there any questions that maybe we can kind of quickly answer here? My clock is showing we're just a few minutes over time, and so I appreciate you all being part of this. So if you've got a question, give you a couple minutes to type it in, and or there's my contact information if you want to contact me with more. Do I have any feeding studies showing a benefit of your product? Yeah, I do. I do, Steve. And if you'll send me an email, we can start corresponding, and we'll walk through those and see if you're looking for dairy or beef or whatever. And so we can do that. Yeah, send me an email and we'll talk through those. There's also some of those in that Flowery grain research summary. All right, I don't see any other questions. So Just going to give a second here just to make sure. So, guys, I really appreciate you, and ladies, if you are out there, I appreciate you all being part of this. And so there will be a few more of these in the future, but look forward to corresponding with any of you who have questions or want to talk through some of these things. You know, we are in the process of discovery, and we don't have all the answers. And so love to walk through those things. So appreciate you all being a part of this, and hope that you have a great day and you found this beneficial. Thank you.